everybody.
You just missed the recording.
Sorry about
Hi, everyone. I'm Brendan. I'm also a fifth year at Adelphi, doing my internship here. Yeah, nice to meet you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Ruthier. I'm a postdoc, and I just graduated from City College.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. I am a first-year Division I candidate.
Hi, my name is Howard Steele. I'm a first year LQP.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Millard. I'm a first-year Division I candidate.
Hello, I'm Allie Meyer, also first year Division I candidate.
Hi, I'm Biagio Mastropiri. I'm also a first year Division I candidate.
Hi, I'm Nina, first year Division I candidate, and I'm an LQP.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm a first year Division I candidate, LQP, PQ, LQP.
Hi, I'm Ezra Yarman. I am a social work intern here from Smith College.
Hi, I'm Rupal. I'm a second year MSW student from Fordham.
I'm David. I'm also a second year MSW student from Columbia.
Hi, I'm Tony Drazen. I'm a first year LQP student.
Hi, I'm Layla. I'm a second year social work student at NYU.
Hi, I'm Dave Koch, and I'm a faculty and analytics supervisor and the director of the social work internship program here at White.
One more, I think.
Hi, I'm Eva. I'm a postdoc.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone. This is a big crowd for us actually in person, and welcome all of you to the Institute. What we're doing today is we've last year and continuing this year, we're highlighting the founders of our Institute and the history. So we have Dr. Gail Hornstein, who's going to talk about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann today. And then in a few weeks, I think in October, Dr. Ira Moses is going to present on Dr. William Allenson White. And that's continuing sort of a theme that we've been doing the last couple of years. So first, let me introduce Dr. Gail Hornstein. On a historical note, Dr. Hornstein was here 22 years ago on 9/11 and was presenting during the attacks. So it's sort of a pretty wild coincidence that she's here today. And as she said earlier, she was happy that it was a different room than the previous one. So we didn't make that up. And on a personal note, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann was someone who inspired me actually to become a psychoanalyst, and one of Dr. Hornstein's books was a big part of that. So it's an honor to have you here today. Dr. Hornstein is a professor emeritus of psychology at Mount Holyoke College. Her research centers on contemporary history and practices of psychology, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. And she's the author of To Redeem One Person is to Redeem the World, The Life of Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. That was the book I was referring to. Which talks about the efforts that Frieda Fromm-Reichmann went to treat her patients and however long that took. She's also the author of Agnes's Jacket, a psychologist's search for the meaning of madness, the meanings of madness. Her articles and opinion pieces have appeared in many scholarly and popular publications, and her bibliography of first-person narratives of madness in English is now in its 5th edition with more than 1,000 titles, and it's used internationally by educators, clinicians, and peer organizations. And for the past 8 years, she has directed the Hearing Voices Research Project, a national research and training effort supported by the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. Dr. Hornstein speaks widely in the US, the UK, and Europe about Fromm-Reichmann and alternative approaches in psychiatry. Dr. Hornstein was telling me earlier, she was a professor for 40 years, is that correct? And an important note, which I left out earlier, we are recording today's session for historical purposes. So if anyone does not want to be recorded, you could leave now. And that's the same for online. For the people online, you have to actually consent. You'll press a button to acknowledge that it's being recorded, but just to let everyone know in person. So with no further delay, Dr. Hornstein, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present here. Can everyone hear me? It's okay. As Dr. Banta said, I lecture very often, and this is a communicative act. So if in any way you can't hear me or there's something that's a problem, don't just sit there and engage in denial. I have to say, it is a very, very intense experience to come back here. It is a coincidence. I've given many talks at White, but it's a coincidence that I was upstairs in the seminar room on 9/11, and everyone engaged in a massive act of denial, and everyone stayed in the room for the entire morning listening to me talk about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann as the events were unfolding around us in the city. So I'm glad to be in a different room, but I'm always glad to come back to White. And I'm glad to see this cheerful picture of Frieda to have accompanying us today. And I will talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes, and then I really, really welcome questions, comments of any kind. And I'm going to give an old-fashioned kind of psychoanalytic paper. I'm going to speak from a paper. There's no bells and whistles. There's no text on the screen, none of that. So just listen and jot down some questions as you have them. This is the tradition of psychoanalytic talks. I'd like to start with several stanzas from a poem titled Power by Adrienne Rich. Here's the poem. Today, I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the element she had purified. It seemed she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died, a famous woman, denying her wounds, denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. Frieda Fromm-Reichmann stands out in the history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis for her deep respect for patients and her insistence that even those with the most serious diagnoses, schizophrenia and other psychoses, understood the meanings of their thoughts, perceptions, and feelings, even if they could not communicate these meanings to others. She eagerly sought ways to enter into patients' experience, however anomalous or frightening, to help articulate its logic and create the possibility for the kind of genuine collaboration between them that could enable recovery, however long that took. In her own work with patients, as well as her teaching and supervision here at the White Institute, at the Washington School of Psychiatry, and elsewhere, Fromm-Reichmann emphasized the talents of even the most disturbed people and the importance of their poetry, writings, and musical compositions, both as evidence of such talents and as sources of psychological insight in themselves. Indeed, for many years, she taught a course called Assets of the Mentally Handicapped to emphasize, first, that psychotic patients have assets. In other words, they are not characterized only by liabilities and symptoms. And second, that the creative works they often undertake as a consequence of such assets are themselves worthy of note. My interest is primarily in the second of these, the works themselves, and hers was usually in the first, the fact that they could be created, but the two are clearly related to one another. As Fromm-Reichmann wrote in her lecture notes for this course, quote, sometimes mental symptoms and other aspects of mental illness can simultaneously become sources of assets in the lives of patients. Simultaneously is the important word in that sentence. Making much the same point as Adrian Rich does in that poem, Fromm-Reichmann wrote of Robert Schumann, quote, his musical accomplishments came from the same psychopathological sources as his failures in living, unquote. And although she emphasized that, quote, patients may have greater personal assets than their doctors, Fromm-Reichmann did not seem to consider the possibility that these assets might take the form of contributions made by patients to psychiatric theory and practice. Today, I'm going to focus only on works that patients have published about psychosis in the form of memoirs, autobiographical fiction, or theoretical works. The question I pose is this: if a patient's account casts doubt on, or offers an alternative to, or even contradicts the views of doctors or other clinicians, does it constitute a valid challenge? In other words, can patients' contributions be considered epistemologically equal to the views of professionals? Fromm-Reichmann did not really consider this possibility. She focused on works by patients that illustrated or illuminated or amplified views that she already held. For example, she often quoted the 1860 work, The Philosophy of Insanity, written by a patient named James Frame, but published anonymously under the pseudonym a late inmate of the Glasgow Royal Asylum for Lunatics at Gartnavel in Scotland. Fromm-Reichmann was so taken with this book that she had it republished in 1947. It was published originally 1860. She had it republished in 1947 and wrote an introduction hailing the author's embrace of a quantitative rather than a qualitative difference between normal and pathological. In other words, a difference only in degree rather than a difference only in degree, a view that she herself very strongly held, that there was only a difference in degree. But what if the patient were to articulate an alternative or even a challenge to the doctor's view? As I said, Fromm-Reichmann does not deal directly with this question, but I think it's instructive to pose because it allows us to ask a broader question, namely, what are first-person madness narratives precisely for, other than serving as evidence of patients' creativity and a window into their subjectivity? Can they be considered contributions to psychiatry or psychoanalysis in their own right? Because many patients have explicitly shared the goal articulated by Daniel Paul Schreiber in his famous Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, where he said he wanted to, quote, contribute to the science of abnormal mental states. You may recall that Freud jokingly suggested to Jung in a letter that, as he called him, the wonderful Schreiber should be named a professor of psychiatry and director of an asylum. Now, Freud was joking, but I'm not joking. Making a contribution to the field is exactly what James Frame, quote, the late inmate, as he called himself, sought to do in his book, The Philosophy of Insanity. Fromm-Reichmann may have considered him insightful and his views perspicacious, but most psychiatrists of his day thought the opposite, namely, that psychosis was qualitatively different from normal experience, and the two were not at all on a continuum. In other words, although Fromm-Reichmann, reading James Frame's work 80 years after its 1860 publication, agreed with his perspective, at the time he published his account, he was challenging the views of mainstream psychiatry. As was Clifford Beers, author of the 1908 classic, A Mind That Found Itself. And if you haven't read A Mind That Found Itself, I urge you to do so as soon as possible. It is an extremely important work in the history of psychiatry. It's in many editions. It's been reprinted dozens of times. Clifford Beers was hailed by Fromm-Reichmann as, quote, one of the great modern psychiatric writers whose work is a direct result of the mental disturbance they had to undergo, unquote. But unlike someone like James Frame, who saw recovery from his illness as a precondition for contributing useful work, Clifford Beers rejected the assumption that recovery was necessarily useful or relevant as a goal, or even certainly not required. Indeed, Clifford Beers' well-documented biography suggests that it is because Beers did not recover that he was able to accomplish so much. His goals weren't proportionate. He didn't become less grandiose. If he had, he would have scaled back his huge ambitions for social change and been less insistent on realizing them. Clifford Beers, who was an example of a very classic manic depressive psychotic patient who had extreme manic periods and extreme depressive periods, Beers directly gratified his delusions of grandeur and, thanks to his gender, race, class privilege, and shrewd use of a pen, which he often called a weapon that he metaphorically compared to a sword or a key, thanks to those advantages he had, he was able to get many famous and influential people to join his cause and satisfy his grandiose desires. A Mind That Found Itself was issued by a major publisher with an endorsement by William James. It's been reprinted dozens of times since its original 1908 publication, and it launched a movement to improve mental health in American society that is still active today. In a 1980 edition of the book, as I say, there are dozens of editions. I'm going to quote from a particular one in 1980 where the psychiatrist Robert Coles wrote an introduction. He called A Mind That Found Itself a work of art that, quote, commands a broadened moral sensibility, which offers an intense probing introspection that Robert Coles compared to the expeditions of self-discovery of St. Augustine, Rousseau, and Freud. Coles even noted that the title of the book showed Beers's capacity for, quote, detachment, wry, even ironic self-observation, a mind that found itself. Again, I'm quoting Coles, combining the virtues of clinical analysis as well as personal reminiscence, all rendered with a novelist's eye. Beers was able to take full advantage of the striking contrasts between his manic and depressive periods to create narrative tension in the story. And he knew, as Coles emphasized, quote, before Freud's writing had become part of our culture, that symptoms are connected to earlier life experiences. Clifford Beers made that clear in 1908. After the book was published, again, I'm quoting Coles, Beers went from, quote, persuasive chronicler to ardent, entrepreneurial, sophisticated, pragmatic organizer and reformer. He understood how American society worked, and he knew how to gain, influence, and raise money from, quote, the wealthy and the powerful. With these resources, Beers helped to create new laws, he changed media representations of mental illness, and he fostered important shifts in cultural attitudes about mental health and mental illness. Bertram Brown, the former director of NIMH, called Beers, quote, the nation's first example of a successful consumer advocate who provided the impetus for the development of a national mental health movement, unquote. In other words, Clifford Beers was no crank. And as historian Norman Dane wrote in the biography he published of Beers, Beers's book, quote, is still timely, speaking to many of the issues raised by reformers in the 1960s and 70s. Despite the stigma and shame of mental illness, especially in his time, in his own time, as Dane noted, Beers was able, quote, to turn himself into an object of admiration. Indeed, Norman Dane wrote in his biography, quote, it can even be said that Beers's manic qualities, his optimism and enthusiasm, his dedication, his energy, his imaginativeness, combined with intelligence and humor, were what made him so attractive even irresistible to so many people, and uniquely fitted him for the work he set out to do. Now, of course, on a day-to-day basis, Beers was often difficult, as such patients often are. These are some of the words that his biographer Norman Dane uses to describe him: erratic, egocentric, needing to dominate, requiring loyalty from his colleagues. And in his own book, Beers, by his own admission, describes himself as having, I love this phrase, quote, an excess of executive impulses. But Dane noted, unlike many crusaders, Beers was, quote, unusual in being so likable and being capable of long devoted friendships, amenable to advice, and willing to work behind the scenes and let famous men have the presidencies and chairmanships. This allowed him to intrepidly approach business tycoons, university presidents, and foundation heads in the conviction he would be treated seriously, as indeed he was. To take just one example, the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins, which Beers convinced Henry Phipps to endow, an accomplishment that Frieda Fromm-Reichmann hailed soon after its founding in the 40s, is an institution that continues to this day. Okay, endowed, encouraged to be endowed by a former crazy person. Now, of course, Fromm-Reichmann never treated Clifford Beers himself, but she did publish several classic papers on manic depression, the best known of which is called An Intensive Study of 12 Cases of Manic Depressive Psychosis. It's in her selected papers and was written, that particular one was written in collaboration with 4 other colleagues from the Washington area. In these papers, Fromm-Reichmann described these manic depressive patients as, quote, professing little interest in refined insight into their interpersonal experiences with people of their previous or present life. She said she said that manic patients use this, quote, lack of interpersonal awareness as their chief defense, together with the defensive processes which are represented by the manic and depressive symptoms themselves, unquote. She said, quote, the lack of subtlety in interpersonal relationships in such patients is due to, quote, their overruling preoccupation with exploiting the other person in order to fill their own emptiness. She said that effective treatment of manic depressive patients required taking, quote, a firm and consistent attitude of refusing to attempt to meet their irrational demands from the beginning. Yet if anyone had actually done this in an effort to cure Clifford Beers, it's unlikely he would have been able to accomplish as much as he did. And it's hard to argue that someone as effective as Beers at getting sophisticated psychologists and psychiatrists like William James and Adolf Meyer to support his work was suffering, quote, from a lack of subtlety in interpersonal relationships or, quote, an overruling preoccupation with exploiting the other person. In other words, Fromm-Reichmann might have appreciated Beers' success as an advocate. That's what she was praising him for. But she didn't link that success to his shrewd ability to exploit his symptoms in support of that end. In her work on patients' assets, as she called them, Fromm-Reichmann gives psychoanalytic interpretations of such famous artists as Schumann, Schopenhauer, Van Gogh, explaining how their early childhood traumas led to their psychopathology and how their accomplishments derive from these same sources. But does this mean that their artistic works are best seen as sublimations of these unfulfilled desires? In other words, transformations of unacceptable impulses into socially valued ones, rather than as creations in their own right. In other words, when Fromm-Reichmann praised Clifford Beers, was she seeing him as a mental patient who managed to do important work, or as a significant reformer in the mold of Dorothea Dix, who happened at various points in his life to have been a psychiatric patient? There's no question that Fromm-Reichmann valued these works. She wasn't implying in any sense that Schumann wasn't a brilliant composer, or Van Gogh an extraordinary painter. But she seemed to understand their works primarily through a psychiatric lens, in a way that she didn't do, say, with a composer like Mendelssohn or an artist like Klimt. That certainly wasn't how Clifford Beers wanted people to regard him. He had been inspired by Victor Hugo and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Very explicitly, he writes all this. And he wanted to be seen as a social reformer with a broad progressive mission. Yes, he agreed, his work to reform the mental health system and the ways Americans thought about psychological life were inspired by his own experiences as a patient. But that just gave his mission even more urgency. To cast it as sublimation would be to reframe his political and social goals in a way that threatens to diminish them. In other words, they become just defenses against his feelings of inferiority. Now, of course, psychoanalytic interpretations don't have to be reductionistic, like the real reason you're doing this is. But alas, they often are. Fromm-Reichmann was never invested in any one way of making sense of patients' experiences, but she was a psychoanalyst to the core and absolutely took for granted that a psychodynamic framework was necessary and more useful than any alternative in making sense of human psychology. Now, of course, sublimation can be understood in its broadest sense to account for every creative expression. But that wasn't really how Fromm-Reichmann seemed to be talking about, quote, assets of the mentally handicapped. She was focused on people with obvious psychopathology who nevertheless managed to accomplish something important. She did, after all, call them mentally handicapped. And even if we would use different terms now, seeing them as disabled to some extent by their problems and needing treatment is still clearly what she meant. Now, some patients would agree with this. Joanne Greenberg, for example, Fromm-Reichmann's best-known patient, has always seen her creativity as inspired by her illness, but only made possible after her recovery. Since I wrote Fromm-Reichmann's biography, I've had the great pleasure to get to know Joanne Greenberg very well. She is extraordinarily effective and has written 20 other books and is now age 91. She saw her creativity as only made possible after her recovery. But Clifford Beers or John Custance, author of an important work on psychological theory, which I'll come back to in a moment, or Nijinsky in his famous diary, all saw their work as important in its own right, not dependent on recovery or any kind of interpretation by a mental health practitioner. They are unlikely to have seen themselves as, quote, mentally handicapped in any sense of the term. Hence, they would not want their work to be, here we come to the title of my talk today, they would not want their work to be in a dialectical relation to Fromm-Reichmann's, but rather in an equal dialogue with hers, as indeed John Custance himself did in his important book that I'll come to in a moment, in which he compared his theory, which he called the theory of actuality, to the theories of Freud, Nietzsche, Goethe, and Jung. In other words, patients like these do not see their contributions primarily as illustrations of some psychiatrist's concepts, but instead as valuable in themselves. Now, let me note that in framing this question, that I'll talk about for a few minutes, in terms of a contrast between dialogue and dialectic, I'm drawing on a long-standing debate in the history of Western philosophy. And since I'm not myself a philosopher, I've based this part of my talk on recent philosophic work by Dmitry Nikulin. Some of you may know him, he's at the New School, whose book Dialectic and Dialogue lays out these issues in a very succinct way. Dmitry Nikulin defines dialogue as, quote, a conversation that follows its own logic instead of the one that an artist or a philosopher, or I might add, a psychoanalyst, imposes upon it. He says that because in a dialogue, quote, every interlocutor is free, the outcome of a conversation can never be predicted in advance. In other words, in a true dialogue, each person is contributing equally, And so you can never tell the form in which the nature of the conversation will take. In contrast, Nikulin tells us, quote, dialectic is considered a universal method of correct reasoning. When we arrive at a conclusion by accepting some arguments and rejecting others, we are using a dialectical method of reasoning. So, if Frieda Fromm-Reichmann is arguing that however insightful patients may be, and however much psychoanalysts might benefit from paying attention to their ideas, these need to be incorporated within a broader psychoanalytic framing because it alone provides the means of correct reasoning. She's adopting a dialectical approach. My question is this: what would happen if we pushed her ideas further to allow a true dialogue between her views and those of patients to emerge? Clear? Now, there's reason to think that she might actually have welcomed this kind of development. As you all no doubt know, Fromm-Reichmann's patient, Joanne Greenberg, is the author of the thinly fictionalized account of her treatment at Chestnut Lodge, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. This so-called novel, it's really a so-called novel, published in 1964, has sold millions of copies, never been out of print, and was just named a Penguin Classic and reissued in yet another new edition. I can't count anymore the number of editions this book has been in since 1964. Greenberg wrote this book soon after Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's death in 1957. But it did not start out as her work alone. After Joanne's treatment was finished, both her 4 years as an inpatient at the lodge and then several more as an outpatient, Fromm-Reichmann had the idea of publishing an account of the treatment from multiple perspectives. She would write one section, Joanne would write one section, and Joanne's mother would write a third. Fromm-Reichmann thought that such a multi-perspectival work would make a valuable contribution to the clinical literature. And some of you may know the book later published by the late London psychoanalyst Joe Burke and his famous patient Mary Barnes, published under the title Two Accounts of a Journey Through Madness, that used that exact format. Joanne drafted a 50-page narrative of the treatment from her perspective. But Fromm-Reichmann died before writing her section, so nothing ever came of that project. Eventually, Joanne turned her draft into what became I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, namely a longer, slightly fictionalized account written solely by the patient. It's impossible to know how Fromm-Reichmann would have shaped the volume that she imagined. Would each of the 3 sections have been left to speak for itself, with no introduction or conclusion by her that wove them together? Probably not. Probably she would have retained for herself the greater voice of authority and written some kind of conclusion, the result of a dialectical process in which her perspective on Joanne's and Joanne's mother's account would have been subsumed within a broader clinical framework. Now, of course, I'm here at the White Institute, so in no sense am I arguing against the value of a psychoanalytic interpretation or psychodynamic therapy, having hugely benefited from them personally, and having spent the last 30 years studying, speaking, and writing about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who exemplified such work at its best. But I am suggesting that what patient activists now call, quote, the expertise of experience, can often be as valid as the expertise of professionals, enabling people who have been psychiatric patients to offer important insights into general psychology, not just to their own mental lives. Their work is not just about, here's my memoir about my experience. Many, many patients are writing works of general theory. When I assigned, for example, John Costance's book, Wisdom, Madness, and Folly, The Philosophy of a Lunatic, published in the early 50s, I believe, my excellent psychology students at Mount Holyoke treated it like any other text. and sought to understand his theory of opposites, just as they did any concept of Freud's or Jung's. And indeed, I was very pleased to see that the Cambridge University Library in Cambridge, England, one of the great academic collections of the world, catalogs John Custance' work on this same shelf as Freud and Jung and other major psychological theorists, even though it has the subtitle, The Philosophy of a Lunatic. And John Custance, like Clifford Beers, had extravagant manic and depressive periods and wrote about them from the inside and then generalized to a more broader understanding of psychology. Now, of course, not every patient is a theorist or a reformer, but neither is every psychoanalyst Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. I'm not trying to suggest that experts by experience are better than any other kinds of experts, or that their work should supplant that of professionals. But I am puzzled as to why there has often been so little interest in learning from patients' accounts. Why, I'm not putting anyone on the spot here, but why every person in this room does not know Clifford Beers's work, A Mind That Found Itself, as much as you know Freud. I'm puzzled as to why there's often been so interest in learning from patients' accounts, and even, sadly, I have to say, by some clinicians, an arrogant dismissal of this idea. Why aren't these texts part of the required reading in psychoanalytic training, as Frieda Fromm-Reichmann herself urged in the 1940s? Now, let me just, because I want to take only another couple of minutes, let's just take a contemporary example of work that we should be considering, contributed by patients. Consider the work that I've been very involved in for 20 years, the Hearing Voices approach, which has now spread around the world as an alternative framework for understanding and ameliorating the distress that can accompany states labeled hallucination, which derives from the insights of Dutch patient Patsy Haga and other voice hearers. Thanks to this approach, thousands of people, many of them diagnosed schizophrenic and considered chronically ill, are now living successful lives, able to make sense of their experiences in ways that fit their own contexts and circumstances. Much of what I have learned from them over the past 20 years has challenged and expanded my own understanding of how the mind works, beyond what I learned and I took for granted from my training and many years of research and teaching. People whose psychological approach derives directly from their voice hearing experiences are now some of my closest colleagues, and they have modeled a humility and a curiosity about the complexities of psychological life that I find inspiring and from which I continue to learn. The people you treat in your practice who actively seek psychotherapeutic help hopefully see your interpretations as beneficial, thereby at least indirectly validating the theories upon which those interpretations are based. Indeed, given how painful psychodynamic treatment can be and how long it can take, patients must have faith that the training and expertise of their therapists will offer benefits they can't create for themselves. As I used to tell my undergraduate students at Mount Holyoke, if I don't know more about psychology than you do, you should demand your tuition money back. And although I am not myself a clinician, after 50 years of studying and teaching psychoanalytic theory, my mind automatically frames psychological phenomena in those terms. Like most of you, I take for granted that unconscious dynamics shape every moment of our lives and are endlessly interesting, if at times exhausting, to try to figure out. But do we actually want to be like Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who was described even by her closest friends and family as, quote, always the therapist, no matter what the circumstances or who she was with? What if other ways of understanding mental life, like Clifford Beers's social analysis or the more current work of the Mad Pride movement, are equally valid? No matter what our specific professional training, whether we're psychologists, psychoanalysts, physicians, social workers, we all assume that this training and the experience we've gained since then have equipped us with ways of understanding mental life that are superior on some criterion we care about. They're deeper, they're more complex, they're more parsimonious, they're more elegant, doesn't matter. We assume that those ways of understanding mental life are superior to what people can typically offer to themselves. But just as Freud and other physicians have long used the exaggerations of psychopathology to illuminate normal psychology, people who have experienced extreme states or unshared perceptions, thoughts, or feelings and emerged from them can offer insights to all of us in understanding how the mind works. Not only how their mind works, but all minds work. Because why else would so many hundreds of patients have published first-person narratives describing and analyzing every conceivable form of psychopathology and treatment, accounts which date from as early as the 15th century? On the most recent edition, as Dr. Banta noted, on a bibliography, I have long compiled the bibliography of first-person narratives of madness. The most recent edition includes 1,000 titles, and these are just ones published as books and written in English. Frieda Fromm-Reichmann certainly valued these works. She sought them out, she recommended them to students, she helped to have James Frame's classic text republished. But I want to challenge us to go even further in understanding their importance. They are not simply vivid illustrations of our theories, as they seem to be for Fromm-Reichmann, offering what contemporary patient activist Peter Campbell derisively called the sauce in someone else's sandwich. They offer contributions in their own right, and some of them challenge core assumptions that many of us hold. For example, I was forced to abandon many of my taken for granted assumptions about ECT after reading Rachel Perkins's account and meeting her at a conference in London. She's a psychologist and thus was able to consent knowledgeably to the procedure. It proved hugely therapeutic for her. Joanne Greenberg has long defended cold, wet sheet packs as deeply reassuring and useful to her, even though most people consider them barbaric. Many of my colleagues in the Hearing Voices movement have published accounts of their voice hearing experiences that are nothing like psychiatric depictions of hallucination. I have learned so much from these first-person accounts, which I have collected, studied, and taught for decades. Most of all, they have taught me humility about our limited understanding of the extraordinary complexity of mental life. Fromm-Reichmann always encouraged psychotherapists to see themselves as participant observers. And while this idea seems appealing, it's not entirely clear what she meant. She adopted this concept from her close friend and colleague, Harry Stack Sullivan, who wanted to distinguish his approach from the passive blank screen that Freud saw as the psychiatrist's role in the therapeutic encounter. For Sullivan, being a participant observer meant being relationally connected to the patient, with the therapist's reactions and feelings a crucial part of the process. Just as physicists had come to understand that an observer could never stand completely outside the field of observation, Fromm-Reichmann argued, following Sullivan, that the therapist could not simply take note of the patient's behavior without being considered part of the interaction. But that didn't mean she saw their roles as equally important. So I want to leave plenty of time for the discussion and questions. So let me just conclude, returning to the terms that are in my title of my talk today, by saying that Frieda Fromm-Reichmann positioned her work in a dialectical relationship to works by patients. And I'd like to encourage a more egalitarian dialogue between them. Although I have critiqued, I would say mildly, her taken for granted assumption that in the end, the therapist's framework is the one that matters, Fromm-Reichmann was still more open than many of her colleagues to being challenged. Her capacity to think flexibly and never be hidebound by convention, and her lifelong effort to respond compassionately to the aloneness of others without being overwhelmed by their need, remain models for all of us. Which is why, after 30 years of studying Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's life and work, I still find it inspiring. And why I want to push her ideas even further, something that I think that she herself might have welcomed. I thank you so much for your attention and quiet.
Thank you so much. We'll open it up for questions and comments, but first, I want to thank you for what a kickoff to the academic year and for the beginning of many of your education and that thread you will learn while you're here. So thank you very much. So we'll start with the in-person audience. If we have any questions, I think we have a question in the back.
And
Stacy.
don't hesitate. I welcome challenges of any kind. Questions, comments, challenges.
Hi. Thank you for your profound and various talk. So what I'd like to ask you is, given everything you've said, what can be our contribution to the patient? What does it mean? What can our help be? And given how kind of egalitarian and how you described the equal weight of the patient's experience and perspective and all of that, and the word diversity is in the mix in terms of equality, and where does the issue of suffering come in? Meaning, I think many of us as patients feel not just, well, this is how I am and it's okay or great or whatever. I am suffering, I'm in pain. Where does that come into it? And that's related to the question of how can professionals be of help?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say that in many different parts of her writing, Fromm-Reichmann referred to herself and the patient, or in more broadly, the therapist and the patient as, quote, fellow sufferers. So I think it's really important to be embracing that view. We are all fellow sufferers. I like the image that Joanne Greenberg offers of her treatment, that she was drowning and Frieda knew how to swim. Now, if you think about that as an image, it doesn't cast any aspersions on the person who's drowning. It's not assuming they're drowning because they're incompetent or they're fundamentally bad or any other thing. It's just the situation they're in at that moment. And then if they're next to someone who knows how to throw them a life preserver or knows how to swim or can see further out, there's a collaborative process there. So I think what I'm trying to point to is, first of all, and I meant to mention this, this bibliography that I've created, you can look on my website and just download it for free. It's available. You can circulate it. You can do anything that will help to get these ideas out. I have no proprietary connection to these ideas. So I think what I've learned, especially from people in the Hearing Voices movement, I'm so distressed when I hear often from them, I told my therapist what was happening in my mind, and they said, in some version, probably not this bluntly, no, that's not really happening. There isn't anybody accusing you of rape. No, that's not happening. Okay, I say this especially to, in this room, we're all psychoanalysts here. Let's really take very, very seriously the notion of psychic causality and the notion that psychological reality is as real as physical reality. If someone is experiencing themselves to be being attacked in their apartment, it doesn't make any difference whether other people can see the attackers. That's irrelevant. the experience of feeling attacked is the thing that is the focus for that person. And so I don't assume, I mean, psychoanalysts are the best people as compared to many other mental health practitioners with respect to taking seriously psychological reality. So I'm not in any sense suggesting that people in this room or people in the audience are not taking that seriously, but I think we can all take it even more seriously. We can really connect to the idea of what the person is reporting about their experience. We can start from that. We can never attempt to explain it away. I mean, an interpretation can often be helpful. As I say, I've benefited enormously from such interpretations, but there is such a thing as interpreting it away. And many people, especially people who have had a psychotic diagnosis, have said, nobody in the mental health system ever asked me what happened to you. They only asked what's wrong with you. And again, psychoanalysts are the best people on this. We believe in trauma theory. We have since the beginning. But there are more levels at which that can be taken seriously. And that's why I encourage you to read as many of these first-person accounts as possible, because you'll get a sense of the extraordinary range of people's experiences. You know, even if you're a busy clinician, you can only see a limited number of people in your practice, and you may not see people who have very different experiences from those.
So what does it mean that we can swim with our own vulnerabilities and our own suffering? What does it mean that we can swim?
Temporarily. That's what I mean. Yes, temporarily at that time you can swim. At some other time you too are drowning. And to never forget that. I mean, that's where I'm mildly critiquing Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, always the therapist, who saw herself as a fellow sufferer, but was always trying to solve people's problems, even those of her friends who didn't often appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll take a question online. Bob Langan, you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. I so appreciate your talk, and I so appreciate your 30 years of work with Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who has been a kind of ghost in my, who appears now and again in my sort of analytic thinking. But I think what you've come to and emphasize about even one can swim and the other can't is the rich and almost incomprehensible depth of what reality can entail. That reality is a kind of construction for each of us. And that would lend itself to the idea that the self, who I think I am, is both an asset and a problem. Because to be a self, I have to define what's me and what's not. You know, it creates a kind of dualism and offers a unique viewpoint. And then, of course, it's the old saw, each of us is unique. And how do you appreciate that? And more widely, reality becomes kind of porous. It can have a personal stamp, but it's a stamp that can vary so much and so widely through the course of life and through the course of suffering, the inevitable sickness, aging, and death that each of us has to go through. Which leads me to ask my question, namely, what do you think the role of, as they call it, plant medicine or psychedelics as an experience to use therapeutically? What do you think of the potential of that as a shift in our field?
I never thought I'd be sitting here bringing together my experience of living through the 60s and writing about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. Thank you for that wonderful question. Oh, my goodness. Where to start? You know, I think that one of the reasons why I've spent 30 years writing and speaking and studying Frieda Fromm-Reichmann and teaching her work to many people is that she had a remarkable interest in an open-mindedness, in an interest in almost anything that could possibly be helpful for people who were suffering. And if you read my biography, you see that she was an Orthodox Jew. She came from a very traditional German family. There are many respects in which you would not expect her to be a person who would have that degree of openness. And although she was, confident of her abilities as a psychotherapist, she never took the view that there wasn't anything more to learn. She always took the view that there were new things to learn. She talked about how thrilling it was that when she met Sullivan in her 40s, I mean, she was a internationally famous psychoanalyst by that point, but she learned lots of new things from Sullivan, and she talked about how exciting that was to be doing that then. So I actually think that, she would be very interested in this as a potential new development. And I say on the basis of my experience in the 60s, anything in moderation. I did know people who, took too many psychedelics and never came back. So I think, some of the current efforts to titrate very, very, tiny doses are very intriguing. I don't know, whether I would recommend them as an approach for patients, but I think there's something really to be refreshingly gained by thinking about a person who, in many personal respects, was very traditional. Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. I mean, like, she never wore costume jewelry because she thought it was trashy. She, those kinds of things. But she would have embraced almost any new idea that might work. And, I myself have adopted at a deep level of my being the hallmark assumption in the Hearing Voices movement, which is anything that does no violence to self or others is worth considering. So I've met many, many people in my work over the past 20 years of people who hear voices all around the world who behave in unusual ways, who walk down the street talking to people that other people can't see. But if it does no violence to them or other people, so what? Why is that a problem? Why is that something? I mean, we go back to Clifford Beers. Why did his grandiosity need to be cured? He became a phenomenal reformer. I mean, there's something to be thought about there in terms of, what is the goal of treatment? Now, of course, he wasn't seeking psychotherapeutic treatment. He was in a number of hospitals that did not help him, but nevertheless.
Thank you. Jenny, you had a question. We'll go to Jenny in the live audience. Okay, then we have lots of questions.
Your book about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann is very inspiring to lots of people.
Thank you.
And I know she's been very, very inspiring to you as well. And it's hard for me a little bit to reconcile this sort of contradiction or whatever. I mean, I know on the one hand, she's been so inspiring. On the other hand, there's really a feeling like she didn't go far enough and she was full of her own sense of authority as the doctor who knew more. And yet, my experience of her as the doctor with patients is that she so believed in them, had so much passion, was an incredible advocate, and did not hold on to, at least with Joanne Greenberg, knowing more than her. I mean, really believed something had happened and was very interested in going into the history and making sense of it, and was steadfast in a way in staying with it. Where I do experience her authority or authoritarianism maybe is in her books to clinicians, which I think are phenomenal and something probably everybody should read coming into this training. And where I feel she really doesn't suffer fools at all is with fellow clinicians and so much of her books are like, no, this makes sense. And she may have a theory about it. I don't think she's as wedded to her particular theory as to you've got to make sense of this as an approach. So yeah, so listening to you is a complicated experience because I'm just so aware of how much she inspired you, and yet the edge that you have around her.
Well, I'm trying to think about, of course, much has happened since her death in 1957. And the fact that there is now an organized international movement of people who have been psychiatric patients, who are advocating on their own behalf, and have not just said we need better treatment, but we need people to actually listen to our ideas about how the mind works. I think that is something that just has happened in the decades since then, since her death. And I think, again, as I said in the last paragraph, I'm critiquing her mildly. I am inspired by her work, and I do, especially for the new students, recommend Principles of Intensive Psychotherapy, her classic text, which has never become less relevant, even though it was published in 1950. Because it does, as you say, in an uncompromising way, lay out the first section of that book is called The Personal and Professional Requirements of the Psychotherapist. And there's a lot of sort of strong language in there about how therapists who are afraid of their patients should get over it or not do this work. That, it's not the patient's job to make the therapist feel better. It's not the therapist's job to impress the patient with his or her brilliant interpretations and show how smart the therapist is. This is a very clear statement, but I do think that actually learning, what I'm trying to encourage here is learning from the actual contributions, the theoretical contributions. If you read John Costance's book, Philosophy of a Lunatic, it's got a well-developed theory called the theory of actuality that is, makes as much sense theoretically as many psychological theories produced by people with PhDs. I'm not saying it's better, but why aren't we thinking about it as a theory rather than good for him? He was a manic depressive patient and he was able to write a book. Isn't that nice? Pet him on the head like a little pet, that I'm trying to get over that pet him on the head part and think about, okay, he's produced a theory. Are we thinking about it as a theory?
Thank you. What I'll do is alternate from the in-person audience and online, but I do see your hands up online, just so that you know. I think we had one more question in the back. Stacy, did you say someone had a question?
No.
Seth, okay. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a really inspiring talk to kick off the year. I had a couple of thoughts. The first is, we've been talking about Joanne Greenberg. We don't have to do a show of hands, but I just think about how many people in this room have actually read I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. I'm going to guess not a lot.
Well,
not as many as should.
Read it before even Clifford Beers, because it's, excuse me for just 1 second. Sorry,
Sure.
I'm gonna say that and Marie Cardinal's book, The Words to Say It.
Yeah,
those two books give a view of psychoanalytic treatment from the patient's perspective that is unparalleled. Please.
Thank you. The other thing, I had a lot of associations listening to you speak, and there were 3 books that I thought about, and I don't know if you can comment on their interface with some of what you were talking about. First is Ellen Sachs, who actually spoke here a number of years ago, who The Center Cannot Hold is a great book for people to read, her own account of her illness. She's become a huge advocate in the legal field for people with psychiatric disabilities, speaking from her own experience. The second is, Kay Jamison, who has a beautiful account of
An
her
Unquiet Mind, that
right.
book is called.
It's a beautiful, beautiful account. And also Touched by Fire, where she talks about artistic sensibility and psychiatric illness. And the last was a recent book, The Best Minds. Have you read that book?
No, say the last one again.
The Best Minds. It came out in the summer. It's by Jonathan Rosen, and it's about his best friend who, it's a very tragic book, who ultimately commits a murder, who is a schizophrenic, who attends Yale Law School and becomes a huge advocate when he's at Yale Law School and afterwards, but ultimately tragically ends this way. But it's a great book about, I think, a lot of what you were speaking about.
Can I make a gentle comment
Sure.
here in the spirit of what I'm trying to encourage? Although Frieda Fromm-Reichmann certainly used the phrase, he's a schizophrenic, as we often have, could we all try to change our locutions and say a person diagnosed as schizophrenic or a person diagnosed with schizophrenia? Because the person is still a person. They may have that diagnosis. We do use some locutions like a diabetic, but we don't use locutions like a cancer.
Thank you for that. I
Gently.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
It's just in the same way as, you know, the diversity movement has taught us to stop using words like a slave and use words like an enslaved person and so on. It makes a big difference. And some of these expressions are a little bit different, sometimes clumsy, but I find in my own experience that once you retrain yourself in how to speak, you just automatically do that. And I think it's important always. But thank you for your suggestions. They're important for all these different books are important and they offer different perspectives. Ellen Sachs is someone who I would challenge a bit more. Ellen Sachs does not, I think, in her own work, contribute a view about how to understand psychosis. I think she contributes a very moving account of her own experience. And because she is also trained as a lawyer, is focused on legal issues. But as I say, Marie Cardinal and Joanne Greenberg really, I mean, Bruno Bettelheim wrote an introduction to Marie Cardinal's book, The Words to Say It. And if you can read French, it was originally published in French with the same title, Les mots pour le dire. It's an extraordinarily evocative book. Bruno Bettelheim calls it the best account ever written by a patient about a psychoanalytic treatment. And you know, one of the challenging features of that book is that Marie Cardinal's main symptom was uncontrolled menstrual bleeding. She bled all over the streets of Paris. And a absolutely classic Freudian psychoanalysis, an outpatient classic Freudian psychoanalysis cured her of this symptom. I mean, in a way that even people who are deep devotees of psychoanalysis find hard to believe. But her account of it is extraordinarily moving.
Thank you. And thank you for the clarification of how we don't label people with the diagnosis. The mental health first aid, there's a movement, and they make a great point in their teaching. I'm going to go to Claire online.
Hi, thank you so much. You know, I got into a reverie about the meaning of the word denial because in your introduction, you used that word many times, including about the 9/11 experience, being able to continue with your presentation. And many times that word in the poem that you introduced the talk with. And I got into a reverie about the meaning of that word, even to the point of thinking are people with mental illness, do they have like a deficit in the capacity for denial? Thinking about denial both as a cognitive necessity and also an emotional necessity, like a denial of vulnerability, but also a way to organize one's experience where you can only focus on certain things or pay attention to certain things and not others. And maybe there's a deficit in that capacity when one is very overwhelmed, either emotionally or cognitively. Anyway, I got into this reverie, especially because you used that word so much in the beginning, and it just struck me, you know, like, what is that? What does that mean? What does denial mean?
I love that expression, which, as you see, I just wrote down that patients might have a deficit in the capacity for denial. You know, is that good or bad? That's a great question. I use that word in the beginning because I think that Adrienne Rich's poem, where she's talking about Marie Curie, the key part is denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. And I think there is where it's really at that crux, that intersection of the wounds and the power, that I'm trying to situate these reflections. I think we would probably all say that in some respects, denial is bad because it's a kind of a primitive defense. It's very often very global. It's kind of like a blunt instrument. But, you know, what's complicated about this, if you think about Clifford Beers again, Clifford Beers basically was denying his inferiority, if you want to use that kind of an interpretation. Now, he had many reasons for feelings of inferiority, and as you'll find out when you read his book, many things happened to him that led him to have feelings of inferiority. And it wasn't like he didn't know he had those feelings, but he kind of triumphed over them. And certainly at the moments when he was doing things like calling up really famous people, and instead of saying, "Hi, I'm a mental patient, will you talk to me?" He basically made clear to them why they should talk to him. And astonishingly, that worked. He wrote to the governor of Massachusetts, for example, and got an audience with him. I mean, people really responded to him. So I think, you're asking an interesting question. I think in some sense, of course, denial is a problem. But in another sense, it can help to create the conditions for being able to transcend it. I think not in a primitive way, not
I also thought that Fromm-Reichmann, I mean, we could think of her as being in a certain, or any authoritarian tendency of being a denial of vulnerability, of one's vulnerability. I think it's probably a language problem, like the word denial, the concept is just, that's just too broad. There's so many different versions of it.
And again, speaking of language, can I also introduce a distinction that I've found super useful in my whole career in teaching? When I was first learning to be a college professor, I heard a lecture by someone where they distinguish between authoritarian and authoritative. Of course, we want to be authoritative. That means we have knowledge that stems from our source of authority. That's why I'm sitting here in the front of the room and speaking and you're listening to me. Is because I have some source of authority that I have accumulated from doing this work for a long time. Authoritarian has an edge of I'm in control and you're not, and you better hear that.
Thank you. I have a feeling we're not going to get to all the questions, but Anna Rosa in person, you have a question? Thanks, Claire.
Hi, I'm so glad to make your acquaintance. This is a great talk. And you've opened my eyes. I graduated as a psychoanalyst 5 years ago. We did not read any first person accounts ever. And I'm wondering if you have it. I only trained here, so I don't know what it's like in other curriculum at other institutes or places for training, but we didn't learn any. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. What is this, an oversight? Is it denial? Do you have any theories about that?
Well, let's put it this way. It's certainly not in keeping with the intentions of the founders of this institute. Because when Frieda Fromm-Reichmann was teaching that course, Assets of the Mentally Handicapped, as I say, we wouldn't use that exact phrase anymore, but that was her point. She constantly urged her students, her psychoanalytic training students, to read these works. She taught this course for years, both in Washington and here. And I think that people should be pushing this institute to change that practice because and again, I'm not making this argument in a spirit of like, oh, gee, patients have written all these works. Wouldn't it be kind of nice if we read a few of them so, we can have a sense of what they think? Or stated more kind of seriously, if we think about Freud's work on Schreber So Freud, as you may or may not know, Freud never met Schreber, even though Schreber was alive and well and he could have met him. He read Schreber's Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, an amazing book, which you should also read. And he interpreted Schreber's account from a psychoanalytic perspective. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Psychoanalysis lends itself to interpretation of many things, and there have been many, many works throughout the history of psychoanalysis in which artists and writers and poets and theorists and so on have been interpreted from a psychoanalytic perspective. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But Freud, in doing that, did not really take seriously what Schreber was trying to contribute as he said, Schreber said, I want to contribute to the science of abnormal mental states. Freud joked that he should be thought of as a professor of psychiatry, but that was a joke. And yes, Schreber thought his body was turning into the body of a woman, and he thought that rays from the sun were producing that, and so on. Not a view with which I agree. But that doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter if I think that's how the body works. Schreber thought that's how his body worked. And, you know, I think you're making a fair critique, and I would love it if I come back to give another talk, God willing, many years from now, and everybody in the audience says, you know, ever since you gave that talk, we changed our curriculum, and now we teach all these books. You know, I'd be happy to come and teach a course here myself on this topic. I mean, it's really, it's not something you should do out of a noblesse oblige. You should do it because you're interested in human psychology and you want to understand how the mind works. And I'll tell you, you know, I've had a long career and I have learned as much, if not more, even though I had a brilliant, fantastic graduate education at Clark University, where I'm proud to have gotten my PhD. I still have learned as much from reading first-person accounts by patients as I have from any other source in my long career.
Thank you so much. We're also lucky to have you here today because I think everyone's learning a lot. And Jenny, notes to Jenny, Director of Curriculum. We'll go to Helen online. Helen.
Yes, I want to thank you very much for your thoughts and synopsis of Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. She's always been someone that I've idealized ever since I read I Promise You, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. In fact, I taught, I think in undergraduate, I taught a psychopathology course, and I used first narrative accounts in order to help the patients, my students understand how the patients thought and felt rather than doing it through the diagnostic route. And I think I've always been interested in the internal world of the patient and trying to make that alive. And the Institute has taught me how to be more and more equal in the process. It has taught me to see psychotherapy is almost like a co-constructed experience where you're both learning something new or a different way of looking at things, a different way about feelings about things. The problem that I get into as I get closer into the intersubjective approach, which is what I'm exploring and reading a lot about, is that how close can you get without feeling as though your own moorings are being taken away, whatever. I think that's the basic fear of getting so close to a patient's psychosis. You know, you can feel what they can feel, and then does that also, how strong, what kinds of capacities and strengths do you need to have in order to be able to pull out of it, to see and feel their madness without getting lost in it. With our own, and I guess with Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, she really did stick to a very strict framework of what the role of the analyst should be, and maybe that's something that you can talk to us about in doing this kind of closer work with patients.
I would say yes, she stuck to. You know, she was the therapist, but I think what has so inspired people for decades about Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's work is that she could be right on that edge of entering into the patient's experience without being lost in it or subsumed within it. And I think the single most important quality that she had that enabled her to do this is that she wasn't afraid of people's craziness. She didn't think it was infectious. She didn't think she would get it if she got too close to them. And I think, there's a famous phrase in one of her papers, the less fear patients sense in the therapist, the less something crazy they are, the less, and one of the things that I explore in my book, which I think kind of leads toward an answer to your question, is that she thought that a lot of the extreme behavior, especially of psychotic patients, came from nobody taking seriously what their experience actually was and being afraid of it. And so the fear, especially, this is classically the case in psychiatric institutions, where the staff are afraid of the patients and their fear produces a much greater intensification of the patient's symptoms that is basically unnecessary. And all the times when, in the days before medication, patients at Chestnut Lodge were often very violent. They were smearing their feces on the walls. I mean, there was really a lot of behavior that, better or for worse, you don't see today. But she would sit down on the floor next to somebody who couldn't get up, who was too involved in their own world, who had urinated on the floor. She would sit down next to them. Now, she didn't sit next to them and say, oh, I'm just the same as you, and I don't care about the fact that you urinated on the floor. She did things like wearing old dresses on days when she saw patients like that, so that she could wash them and not be overly focused on her own discomfort, because she thought a patient who had to do that was trying desperately to convey something that they couldn't convey in words. And if she could quickly get it, they wouldn't need to do that. And that especially violence, she always emphasized that patients were humiliated by their own violent outbursts. And that if they weren't pushed to it and forced into it, basically, by the fear of the people who were around them, they wouldn't need to do it. And not only would there not be a violent interchange that everybody would have to deal with, they themselves would not feel humiliated by having had to be forced to that extreme.
Thank you. Mary, you have a question? Microphone, thank you.
Thank you for a lovely, informative talk. I really just have a couple of thoughts. One is, when I listen to you, it feels like you're really addressing how we have let the psychoanalytic treatment of psychosis go in many ways. Because I think, analysts are, open-minded analysts are always learning from patients. I think people change theory because of, they may call it their own, but they learn from clinical experience with the patient. And so when I listen to you, I really feel what we've lost. And certainly Frieda and Sullivan really in working with psychosis and not hearing. That's and putting, however things have just gone in society in terms of drugs and being afraid. That was the other thing I just wanted to comment on, is that, I hear Ed Levinson's voice in my head saying, most of what we say in the room, we say out of our own anxiety. How powerful the fear in coloring the dynamic can be. And you're obviously touching on that. Thank you. I want to give other people.
Thanks, Mary. It also reminds me of how oftentimes it's early in our careers that we're working with psychotic patients, and then we move on, and there's also a loss there, I think. Jack, you have a question online?
Hi, thank you very much for that. It was very thoughtful. And living in the internet age, I was able to order the Beers book while you were speaking. But the other thing is, I just wanted to correct the historical record of your visit. I was at the meeting that Tuesday morning, but I did not hear you speak because York Bosie, as I recall, was chairing the meeting and said, well, we should do what they do in Israel, which is we should just proceed as life as if it were normal. It was his advice. And then one of the secretaries put up a note on the door saying the Red Cross was looking for volunteers. And about half a dozen of us got up and spent the day with the Red Cross, a 911. So I just wanted to say some people were engaged in denial, but some of us were engaged in activism. But thank you again. That was a very thoughtful talk you gave.
Thank you. And I remember vividly the hand from the secretary or someone from the office who put on the door on the inside of the conference room so that people in the room could read it, but not interrupt me with that statement that the Red Cross needs people. I just remember that hand.
Yeah.
Thank you. Charles, one more question.
Yes, okay, very quickly. I want to say that I had the good fortune before I began my formal clinical training to work for about 4 years in a psychiatric rehab center, where I was just one of the people were considered members, not even patients. And the phrase that of course, I read Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, and it was very helpful. But the phrase that really carried me through was the Sullivan statement, we're all more simply human than otherwise. And that just became kind of an odyssey of getting to know and having a connection as deep as I'd had with any other person, sane or insane. The relationships were maybe even deeper. And there was something about just letting go of somehow I'm different and separate, that we really share this. And I do think that as a common ground with Frieda Fromm-Reichmann saying that it's a matter of degree. So in a sense, she's saying the same thing in her own way. They were all just simply more human than otherwise. So I think you're taking that even further. And I appreciate that. And really saying, well, yes, let's be serious about that and say that these people listen in a dialogue, a genuine listening, which is really where it all comes down to, and to being able to listen and learn from each other.
Thank you. And I'll just contribute from my own experience in the last 20 years. One of the things that the Hearing Voices movement has contributed is the development of peer support groups for people who hear voices. And I've helped to start many of these groups in the United States, and there are now hundreds and hundreds of these groups around the world. If you don't know about this approach, look on the website hearingvoicesusa.org. And partly because I'm not a clinician, I've been able to be a co-facilitator with a voice hearer of peer support groups. And because I can go into the meeting and say to everyone, I've never given anyone a medication. I've never treated anyone in psychotherapy. I've never put anyone in a hospital. I'm just here to learn from your experience and help facilitate a good conversation. It helps sort of diffuse the situation. But because of that, I have now been in hundreds of meetings with people, most of whom have been diagnosed schizophrenic, some of whom had violent pasts according to things they've reported. I haven't seen it directly necessarily, but and I've just been one person in a circle in a room where I don't myself have voice hearing experiences, but I certainly have experiences of fear or suspicion, or we all have moments where we wonder, do other people feel the same way? Like, is this party actually so weird? Like, isn't this a strange class? Like, why are people so behaving so suspiciously? Or something where we feel like we have some kind of a difficult sense of a situation that other people may or may not share. And it's really been extraordinary to me. Before I started doing this, I just really wouldn't have thought I had that much in common with people who had a schizophrenia diagnosis. I just, I don't know if that's arrogance on my part. I just didn't think that. But now I realize it's not just a matter of degree. We are really much more simply human than otherwise. And even people who have had very, very different experiences from mine, there's just a common core of things that we share that is so much greater than the things that are different. And it's been so moving to me to experience that over and over again.
I think that's a perfect point to stop on. We're out of time. And thank you so much for coming today and starting us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to everybody online and everyone here.